Why China should leave Africa. Chinese influence in Africa is high on the global agenda, as China within just a few decades has become a key political and economic power in the continent. Indeed, its emergence as a dominant economic and political actor might be the most important development in Africa since the end of the Cold War. China's relations with the African continent date back to the 15th century. Although China at the time was relatively underdeveloped, it provided extensive assistance to emerging African countries. A well-known example from the early 1970s is the Tanzam Railway project, which connected the copper belts in Zambia with the port of Dar es Salaam. This enabled Zambia to export copper without having to pass through South Africa or Rhodesia. How should African states respond to China's increased presence in Africa? China's economic relations with Africa. Until the late 1970s, the People's Republic of China's economic relations with Africa were driven by ideological imperatives. Today, China's political leadership views economic relations with the continent as a means to achieve the country's development goals. Within a few decades, China has emerged as Africa's biggest bilateral trading partner, Africa's biggest bilateral lender, as well as one of the biggest foreign investors in the continent. Chinese companies have entered almost all African markets. Today, there are more than 1,000 of them operating in Africa. Some 1 million people of Chinese descent reside on the continent. Many of these Chinese companies in Africa are privately owned, while others are wholly or partly state-owned. Within this framework, Chinese companies have great degrees of freedom to operate in Africa on market terms, in addition to being backed by Chinese investment capital on favorable terms. Chinese investments in Africa. In 2019, total Chinese foreign direct investment (FDI) to Africa amounted to $44 billion, which corresponded to 2% of global Chinese FDI. Total FDI from the US to Africa was $78 billion, making it the top investor in the continent. American FDI to Africa, however, amounted to only 0.7% of its total outward FDI. The UK was the second largest investor in Africa, with $65 billion, followed by France with $53 billion. For the UK and France, FDI to Africa accounts for 3% of their global investment. Therefore, while Chinese investments have increased over a few years, the totality cannot be said to be extraordinary. China trades with almost all countries in Africa and does not discriminate between regions. On the surface, it might seem that China's economic relations with Africa follow an opportunistic market-based logic. It is partly true, and Chinese corporations operating in Africa are guided by commercial opportunities. However, such an observation does not provide a complete picture. Chinese political decision-makers consider economic relations with Africa as a means to satisfy goals for their economy, and they also facilitate the country's wider geopolitical aims. This means that commercial relations with some big countries that are rich in raw materials or have other assets that China considers vital, such as Angola and its oil, Zambia and copper, or DRC and cobalt, are buttressed by close political relations that China has ambitiously pursued. The emergence of China as an additional trade partner was a key factor behind the high economic growth rates in Africa from the late 1990s to 2014. Higher Chinese demand for African exports improved terms of trade in the continent, providing the countries with additional financial revenues. With China as a new important trading partner, African countries were provided with an additional market for exports and imports. It enabled African nations to diversify foreign trade and become less dependent on trade with the US or EU. Growing trade with China increased Africa's overall global trade, implying that trade creation outpaced trade diversion. Both gain when China provides African countries with capital goods and cheap consumer goods, and African countries supply China with the commodities required to fuel its economic expansion. Moreover, when African consumers are given choices in, for instance, mobile phones, they are empowered. Lending to Africa. In addition to trade and FDI, loans comprise an increasingly important component of China's economic relations with Africa. A decade of rock-bottom interest rates has triggered a global search for yield, yet not enough private capital has been flowing to Africa. African countries often cannot afford to build the infrastructure they need to support their growing populations. Moreover, many of them lack access to international capital markets and banks. In this vacuum, China has emerged as Africa's largest bilateral lender. Indeed, the Chinese government and its state-owned banks have lent record amounts to governments in low and middle-income countries since the early 2000s, making China the world's largest official creditor. It is estimated that 62% of African bilateral debt is owed to Chinese creditors. Research by scholars at the University of Sussex shows that since 2015, China has accounted for 13% of bilateral lending to Africa. The next biggest creditor is the US at a much lower 4%. According to estimates provided by the SAI's China-Africa Research Initiative, Chinese credits to Africa amounted to $148 billion in 2019. Of this, $44 billion, 29.7%, is allocated to investments in infrastructure, $36 billion to energy, and $18 billion to mining and extraction. Chinese loans to Africa have helped finance large-scale investments, with potentially significant positive effects on growth. At the same time, large lending flows have resulted in the buildup of debt service burdens. In all, Chinese lending to Africa has covered over 1,000 projects. While China's dominant footprint in African trade is well documented, its lending to Africa is less understood. Analysts point out that unlike other major economies, almost all of China's external lending and portfolio investments are official, meaning that they are undertaken by the Chinese government, state-owned companies, or state-owned banks. Two banks dominated Chinese overseas lending: the Chinese Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank, CDB. The same study further underlines that China does not fully disclose its official international lending, and there is limited standardized data on Chinese overseas stocks and flows. Adding to such paucity, commercial providers such as Bloomberg or Thomson Reuters do not keep track of China's overseas loans. It is therefore difficult to obtain precise information about not only the magnitude of Chinese lending to Africa, but also the rates of interest and terms of maturity and the kind of collaterals involved. The situation is thus such that most of China's bilateral lending is carried out by so-called policy banks and state-owned commercial banks, which may be controlled by the Chinese state but operate as legally independent entities, not as sovereign lenders. Unlike the members of the Paris Club of the biggest sovereign creditors, Chinese loans often require collateral for development loans. Since Chinese loans are backed by collateral, they often enjoy a high degree of seniority. If an African country wants to apply for debt relief, its Chinese creditors can claim the rights to assets held in escrow. This is another possible inroad for China to claim assets in African countries, often mentioned by critics that claim that the country has neo-colonial ambitions and methods. When a country's debt service burden is not transparent, debt sustainability analyses are hampered. For private investors, this makes asset pricing difficult. Furthermore, a lack of transparency may be an obstacle to crisis resolution, since information on the size and composition of a country's debt is essential to assure fair burden sharing and orderly crisis management. Chinese banks often tend to renegotiate sovereign loans bilaterally and without transparency. This explains why Chinese lending to Africa has been the subject of debate and controversy. Some have suggested that Beijing is deliberately pursuing debt trap diplomacy, imposing harsh terms on its government counterparties and writing contracts that allow it to seize strategic assets when debtor countries run into financial problems. Others argue, meanwhile, for the benefits of China's lending and suggest that concerns about harsh terms and a loss of sovereignty are greatly exaggerated. Still, others suggest that the debate is largely based on conjecture, as neither policymakers nor scholars know if Chinese loan contracts would help or hobble borrowers, as few independent observers have seen them. They argue that existing research and policy debate rests upon anecdotal accounts in media reports, cherry-picked cases, and isolated excerpts from a small number of contracts. If there is anything more certain, it is that Chinese lenders are willing to extend loans to poor African countries, without demanding much in terms of governance reforms and anti-corruption measures. The result has been projected they are bound by draconian lending conditions, are expensive to operate, and unlikely ever to produce decent returns. Chinese foreign lending to developing countries already seems to have been reduced in the last few years. From a record figure of $75 billion in 2016, Chinese lending in 2019 shrunk to $4 billion. Such a massive decline cannot be explained only by a general global economic downturn. It is most certain that this is due to specifically Chinese circumstances. China will likely put more emphasis on commercial gains from its future investments. It is reasonable to assume that, in the future, China will no longer be as big of a lender to Africa, as African nations will continue to have substantial needs for foreign capital. Reduced Chinese lending could open possibilities for others, such as the European Union and India. Over the past decade, many African nations have accumulated higher debt burdens. Each country profile is unique, and a lot of this began before China became a big lender. Debt relief for African countries is becoming an important topic on the international agenda. Being a large creditor, China will have a significant role in the process. Chinese creditors have restructured loans in the past and appear willing to renegotiate arrangements and allow borrowers to defer payments. Chinese creditors, however, prefer such negotiations to take place on a strictly bilateral basis. China as a political factor in Africa. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation held its first ministerial conference in Beijing in October 2000. The forum's objectives include the promotion of political cooperation and the creation of a favorable environment for China-Africa business and trade. Other commitments from China are providing special funds to support well-established Chinese enterprises to invest in African countries, cancel debts, send extra medical teams, and develop student exchanges. In China, land cannot be owned by private individuals. However, there are possession rights that can be valid for up to 70 years. Since 2015, registers for possession rights have been established in municipalities. In addition, individuals can own real estate, but not the land they stand upon. In Africa, Western countries and NGOs have initiated the formalization of property rights in several countries. In this, there is no normative agreement with China. China's strategic and military interests in Africa. Economic globalization has meant that Chinese business interests also benefit from long-term economic rules and the prevention of conflicts and wars. Thus, in 2008, Chinese warships arrived on the coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean to take part in international operations against piracy, as those activities have also affected Chinese ships. It was the first time China's navy operated in these waters since the 15th century. Soon it was clear, however, that the Chinese presence was not aimed at only fighting pirate attacks. When piracy subsided around 2012, the Chinese warships remained, and China declared that its naval presence is part of an ambition to protect its economic interests in the Middle East, North Africa, and East Africa. It can also be seen as part of the Maritime Silk Road, a major infrastructure project proposed by President Xi Jinping in 2013, which would primarily involve Chinese investment in ports. The Chinese naval presence was further expanded by a naval base in Djibouti. On 1 August 2017, the 90th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army, the base was inaugurated. It is the country's first naval military base outside China and is leased for 10 years, for which China pays $20 million annually. For one, China is training on-site African armies, police forces, and soldiers involved in multilateral peacekeeping operations. China also provides financial support to the African Union's military operations, conducts military exercises with African countries, and plays an active role in UN peacekeeping operations in the continent. Reasons why China should leave Africa. Chinese activities across Africa raise serious questions about their potential consequences on the environment and climate. Some fallout from Chinese projects across the continent includes the prevalent use of fossil fuels, increased pollution, and heightened incentives for the illegal exploitation of natural resources. Chinese loans have been used to finance coal projects in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Morocco, Malawi, Botswana, and Zambia. According to the China-Africa Research Initiative, since 2000, Chinese state-owned banks have supplied $3.7 billion in financing for coal projects in Africa, totaling 6,800 megawatts. Many African countries have been eager to proceed with coal-powered energy projects that only China will finance, as they want to meet the energy demand quickly and place less importance on long-term environmental damage and the contribution to climate change. The Chinese government and its lending institutions have recently shown signs of reducing support for coal projects abroad, but it is unclear if this is a temporary pandemic-related dip or a policy shift. Another negative externality of Chinese engagement in Africa is environmental degradation and pollution. For instance, Ghana's leaders, with the help of a Chinese state-owned enterprise, are attempting to mine bauxite in a world-renowned forest reserve called Ottawa. Local activists and water experts say that the mining would taint the water for 5 million people. In addition, the mine is expected to have an impact on an estimated 17,400 hectares of protected forest area, according to a 2018 Human Rights Watch report. Mining bauxite has had devastating consequences in a number of African countries. The report found that mining in Guinea damaged farmlands and water sources and coated crops in the dust. Sand mining conducted by a Chinese company, Hiyu Mozambique Mining Co., has severely affected the housing and living conditions of Nagano residents in Mozambique and likely significantly contributed to a flood that partially destroyed a coastal village, leaving nearly 300 people homeless in February 2015. Hiyu denied responsibility. However, Amnesty International concluded that all of the available evidence strongly suggests that Hiyu's mining activities, and in particular the way it deposited sand across the landscape, placed the coastal village at heightened risk of flooding. Chinese commercial engagement with Africa has also heightened incentives for illegal or damaging, often both, exploitation of natural resources. For example, Chinese demand for African timber has led to significant black market activity. In 2017, the Environmental Investigation Agency detailed how 1.4 million illegally harvested logs in Nigeria with a market value of $300 million were laundered into China, with more than $1 million worth of bribes paid to Nigerian government officials. Furthermore, in 2018, Chinese entities owned around 90% of Ghana's industrial fishing fleet despite Ghanaian law forbidding foreign ownership or control. This sort of illegal fishing has cost the Ghanaian economy an estimated $65 million per year. Illicit fishing operations place Ghana's fish stocks under pressure, so much so that pelagic fisheries in the region may collapse within 3 to 7 years. Lastly, the Chinese market for a jiao, a traditional medicine made from gelatin extracted from boiled donkey skins, has put donkey populations at risk throughout several African countries, such as Botswana, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Kenya. For many vulnerable populations, donkeys are a vital labor resource to transport food, water, firewood, goods, and people. From the presentation, the presence of China in Africa is a win-win situation for both parties, and the question remains, will Africa survive without China? What step do you suggest Africa take on this? Leave your comments below. See you in our next video.